Hello, welcome back to the channel. It's me, Emmy the Cat Lady, and you join me. We're back here in Big Mountain. We are in a place called the Cuckoo's Nest, which is just here, so to the east of the artillery launch and to the northwest of the X2 transmitter antenna array. So one of the other human, they're technically not mutations, these ones, but they have been physically altered in some way to make them a threat, so they fit into this category in that sense. So we're talking about the Lobotomites, in case you hadn't guessed. I say there's one here. Usually whenever you come into this place, new ones spawn, even if you've cleared it out before, which I clearly have, because there's a goo pile there and a goo pile there. So the Lobotomites are found all over the crater, so if you've ever played Old World Blues even for 5 minutes, you've probably seen one. They pop up everywhere. They like to spawn when you pick up unique weapons and things. They're everywhere. They're like locusts in the crater here, and they were probably like previous residents, or more likely wanderers from the baseland that have come in and been brought to the Big Mountains medical facility. So the Sinks Autodoc basically performed procedures where their major organs were removed and replaced with electronics. And this stops them from leaving because the crater has a radar fence around it, which can't be crossed if there's not a functioning brain inside a body that is also functioning. If you don't have that, then you can't leave. And they have replaced their brains with Tesla coils, the coils of Nikola Tesla, which is supposed to keep their cognition intact. But there was an error with the programming that meant that they were essentially lobotomized, so part of the brain was destroyed, or the brain in its entirety was destroyed. So this leaves them as mindless and aggressive, although usually not to each other. Sometimes you'll see them fighting, and apparently they inject body fluids into each other. Less said about that, the better. But they are aggressive, so obviously every time you see them they are hostile, which is to be expected. And this is their little home base, which is called the Cuckoo's Nest, so we'll go back to that later. But I think it's important to talk about exactly what a lobotomy is, because it's a word that people throw around and might not understand exactly what it is or the history behind it. So medical terminology it does get complicated. It's not always easy to understand when you're looking at medical terminology. A lot of it derives from Greek, because Greek was the original language used by like Hippocrates, so a lot of modern medicine stems from what happened in Greece. So a lot of the words that are used are Greek. If not Greek, then it's usually Latin. Occasionally other words get thrown in there from other languages, like jaundice, which is where someone turns yellow, comes from the French word for yellow. So, but most of the time we're talking about Greek, or we're talking about Latin, or a mixture of both. So you could get confused between lobotomy and other medical terms that sound quite similar, like you might have heard of phlebotomy, spelled Phlebotomy, which is taking blood from a vein, or bloodletting, which was, but generally a phlebotomist is someone that takes blood samples from people. So you probably know that one. A lobectomy is removing the lobe of something, so any organ that has lobes, which could be the brain, the lungs, or the liver. A lobectomy is removing the lobe of an organ, while a lobotomy is cutting connections within the brain, so basically disconnecting one part of the brain from other parts of the brain. So the key that sometimes trips a lot of people up is the difference between ectomy and otomy. So ectomy as a suffix in surgical terms means to cut out or remove. So if you had an appendectomy, that's where your appendix is removed. While otomy just means to cut open. So laparotomy is where you would open up the abdominal cavity, and that's called a laparotomy because you're cutting it open but you're not cutting it out. So that's kind of the distinction there. So essentially a lobotomy is a procedure that severs the connections in the prefrontal cortex of the cerebrum, so the big part of the brain And the prefrontal cortex is responsible for processing information and adapting your thinking in order to handle new situations. So when you're faced with a situation, your brain uses past knowledge and past experience and things to dictate exactly what your response to the situation is going to be. So it has connections to memories, to knowledge and information that you have, to your emotional centers, all these kinds of things to dictate how you're going to respond to that situation. So that's the part that's damaged when you're performing a lobotomy, and they were used quite a lot historically to treat psychiatric disorders, which did include things like anxiety, depression, hysteria, which isn't a real thing, but that was kind of considered that at the time. Schizophrenia and other psychiatric disorders. It was also used as a treatment for neurological disorders, so people that had epilepsy. But the procedure had a lot of complications and caused a lot of problems. So firstly, it could actually trigger seizures in patients, as well as causing things like incontinence, which is where you can't control your bladder or your bowel function and have accidents all the time. Loss of personality, loss of intellect, loss of responsiveness. So, people could even end up catatonic after having this procedure done. And post-operative complications were also potentially really severe, so intracranial bleeding, bleeding the brain essentially, which can be deadly. Infections that can lead to abscesses, which can also be very serious when the brain is involved. And things like dementia and obviously death. Any procedure comes with the risk of death, but it wasn't that uncommon with lobotomies, especially if there was bleeding or infection that got involved. Thankfully nowadays these procedures are very rare, but they were quite commonplace in the 1940s and the 1950s. So the lobotomites that are here, they're typically used either as part of experiments or for cleaning tasks and that kind of thing. But many of them roam the crater and worship posters, and I'm not actually joking about that, because we can see in the background here we have a little shrine. So when you're doing the quest All My Friends Have Off switches and you're looking for the personality holotape for the toaster, this is where you find it, on this little shrine of toasters with candles and all the rest of it. And the toaster is the best character in Old World Blues, and I'm not going to be hearing any criticisms on that. That is just a fact. But remember, this place is called the Cuckoo's Nest, and going cuckoo is a euphemism that's used for madness. So when it comes to combat with the lobotomites, they've got quite a high HP, but they're not very well armoured. So yeah, 146, which isn't, and damage threshold's only 7, so they don't have a lot of armour. They're usually wearing either these jumpsuits, or some of them are still running about in the patient gowns. And they tend to be armed with either guns or melee weapons, but at high levels they can have high-level guns like rush guns in their hands. But a lot of them are melee, and they'll often use like the proton axes. Sometimes they've got the proton throwing axes or the Saturnite fist. They typically fight in groups, so usually you'll see maybe 3 or 4 of them in a group, and sometimes they will join up with a Night Stalker or with one of the Y-17 trauma override harnesses, something like that. So they do kind of get along with the other denizens of the crater. And there's a unique one which is called Test Subject 1, and to find him, he's right here. He's probably one of these goo piles. I can't even search it, so who knows. But yeah, he is here, and he has the proton inversal axe on him. That's the weapon he carries. But yeah, you can see, I'm not sure what that... I'm not sure what that gun is, but... Oh, nice. What did you have? Caravan shotgun, there we go. Yeah, and they've got the lobotomite goggles, they've got the jumpsuit. If you take the... Oh, never mind, I was going to say I'll show you what his head looks like, but it's not there anymore. Oh dear. It's fine, I'll put up a picture over the video of what their face looks like. So they do have a kind of unique appearance to their face. So there's a lot of bruising around the eyes, and there's also a jagged scar across the forehead, obviously a result of the surgery that they had. And here, if you come outside of here, there's a warning from Ulysses. So Ulysses left these little symbols all across the crater to give you a warning. It does, I'm sure he's put one somewhere around here. Yeah, there it is. Yeah, so there's a blue one, so it does mean that there's loot here, but there is also potential danger in this place because of the lobotomites. But this is their house, so very, very interesting. You know, we've just got these guys roaming the crater, but they were originally thought up for Fallout 2. The intention was that they were going to be part of a random encounter in Fallout 2 where a renegade Brotherhood of Steel soldier would come along and help the Chosen One fight the lobotomites, but that encounter was cut early in development of Fallout 2, so the lobotomites were then brought back for this DLC, and they do fit in quite nicely with all the mad science and whatnot that goes on in this place. So I think they worked really well as a good enemy to have here. And it's quite an interesting thing because, of course, if you start this DLC, then you also become a lobotomite. That's what they do. They kidnap you and they take out your brain, your heart and your spine and replace them with synthetic versions that are in some ways quite superior actually to what you had before. But the reason that you don't lose your faculties like these lobotomites do and you can still function is because of the scarring in your brain. So when Benny shoots you at the beginning of the game, of course, that causes damage and leaves scarring on the brain. So what happened is that forced the autodoc to correct its programming to account for the damage, so your procedure becomes a success where the lobotomites that you find across the crater did not. So that's kind of the reason that's given for that, and that's why it worked for you. But you obviously have the option of putting your organs back at the end of the DLC. So yeah, very interesting one. And this location, the home base of the lobotomites, is the Cuckoo's Nest, and it is a reference to a novel that was published in 1962 called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and the main character had electroshock therapy, another fairly brutal treatment that used to be used a lot for mental health disorders but now is quite rarely used, and the character was also later lobotomised, and the novel was made into a movie in 1975 as well. So lobotomies, we can agree now, is not really a very good way of treating psychiatric disorders, and thankfully psychiatric care has advanced far beyond this. But in the 40s and 50s, these kinds of procedures were very common in asylums, and you know, institutions where people were treated. And unfortunately, women were significantly overrepresented because a lot of women were sent to asylums for things like getting pregnant out of wedlock or being too outspoken. Sadly, that was a reality. But we know better now, at least by and large, we know better that mental health matters and mental health problems are real, they're not imagined, and you know, we have better ways of treating it now with different kinds of talk therapy, with medications and that kind of thing. And so treating mental health is much better. There's still a long way to go, I think, before it's going to ever be close to perfect, but it's far better than what it was when we were lobotomising people and doing electroshock therapy and that kind of thing. So there's much better options now, which is a relief. Because it's not an easy thing. I've struggled with my mental health. I probably have mentioned this before. I have physical health problems as well, but I have also struggled with my mental health over the years. And it's something that's a big concern in the veterinary industry as well, because a lot of vets do suffer with that, and we do have a much higher suicide rate than the kind of average. It's 4 times the rate of, the kind of public in vets, and it's not an easy thing to live with, and I'm sure a lot of people can agree it's difficult, but we have better options now, which is always a good thing. And we do have to remember no medical intervention is completely harmless, of course. Whenever you're a doctor or a nurse or a vet or whatever is making choices about what treatment options to recommend, then there's always going to be a bit of a risk-benefit analysis. So you're always weighing up, is the potential benefit outweighing the risk of side effects or the risk of harm being caused. We're trying to kind of minimise the harm caused as much as possible. And so a lot of this is based on evidence, medical evidence. So we practice evidence-based medicine, which means that we have a background of information to say why this medication might be beneficial versus, that procedure or whatever. So it's, nothing that you do is ever guaranteed to work perfectly for every single person. Biology likes to vary itself. Things don't always happen the way you expect them, and that's part of the reality of doing these things. But there are, we move on and we realise, okay, maybe lobotomising people is causing more problems than it's solving. Maybe it's causing harm that doesn't need to be done. But the think tank have kind of forgotten that. They've forgotten that the lobotomites are people. They've forgotten that they were people once as well. And I think losing that identity and that sense of yourself, becoming these kind of, he's got his Saturnight fist, becoming this sort of kind of mindless. It's not quite like a zombie, but they're not capable of holding a conversation. They can speak, but they don't really seem to have much of a vocabulary, and it's usually just short words, 1 word or 2 word sentences that they say when you're fighting them. And losing that identity and losing that kind of sense of who you are, I think, is pretty horrible. So I do think that, eliminating the lobotomites when you find them, you're probably doing them a favour, putting them out their misery in some way. Certainly that's what I would believe. I don't know if you guys feel the same way, but I suppose it's maybe not up to me to make that decision for them, but we're doing it anyway. But yes, the lobotomites, I think they are really interesting, and this shrine to the toaster and things. I mean, the toaster is my favourite. I love the toaster. He's so funny. Am I hitting your weapon? Yeah. Hi. That worked. There we go. Yeah, I do like them. I mean, everything about Old World Blues is great, but the lobotomites, they're so creepy as well, that, they've got these goggles on and they're just kind of, yeah. But thankfully, a wee bit of brain surgery goes a long way, but modern mental health care has thankfully advanced beyond lobotomies and other cruel, unhelpful treatments. But, in the think tank, the big empty, we don't really care about ethics or anything like that. That just stands in the way of progress and then gets in the way of science, and obviously we can't have that. So, yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed this. It's always fun to be back in my favourite DLC, and I'll be back on next Saturday, with another humanish mutation to talk about, so hopefully you'll be looking forward to that. On Tuesday, we're going to be spending some more time in the Georgetown area of Washington DC, visiting a couple of other locations there. And then on Thursday, we will have the season finale of Fallout Season 2 to talk about. So very, very excited to see what comes next with that one. It's gearing up to be a very interesting episode from this week's episode, so we'll see how that goes. So yeah, hopefully you'll come back for that. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll catch you guys later. Bye.